For Crema Media's Polity, I'm Sane Dhlamini. Researcher and analyst Professor Raymond Suttner joins me for Suttner's View, a weekly commentary on South Africa's political scene. Welcome, Professor.
Thanks, thank you.
You knew Chris Hani. Can you please tell us what he was like and whether you think that his legacies are sufficiently well known and observed?
Well, you know, when I say I know Chris Hani, I didn't know him very well. I wasn't in exile, and I only met him in 1990. Although before then, sometimes people would come to me inside the country and they would say to me that they had this or that message from Chris Hani. And so I did indirectly have some contact with him, but we never knew one another. So a lot of what I know, and even when I was on the National Executive and on the Central Committee of the Communist Party, I was in the leadership with Chris Hani, but what I know about Chris Hani is mainly what I observed and what I saw and what I heard from other people. I know a lot from my interactions with him, but most of what I know is what I heard from others, because after he died, I did a number of interviews with people about him, but I also have heard a lot. But you know, when I think of Chris Hani, the first thing I think of is how he was always laughing. He was a very funny person and very good-humoured, even though his life was always in danger. In the period before Chris Hani died, there were a lot of media reports which were making him out to be a danger and a threat and all these things. In some ways, the media reports created a climate where, when Chris was assassinated, it actually seemed as if a danger to society was being removed. So he was living under constant danger, but he was a very, very dedicated person. As a young boy, there's a film on him, I think it's maybe on YouTube. His mother explains how he wasn't like other boys. He would help with the washing up and all these things. He used to have to walk very far he was in the Sabalele Valley near Koffenwaba in the Eastern Cape. He used to have to walk very far to school. He was a religious Catholic at that point. He wanted to become a priest, but his father said no. And his father was a communist, if I remember correctly, wouldn't let him become a priest. And he went to Fort Hare and studied classics and knew Latin very well, things like this. A friend of mine was at Fort Hare at the time, Comrade, and he describes Chris as a real country bumpkin, you know, when he arrived there. You know, clothes that didn't fit properly, all these sorts of things. So he came from the poor. He knew what it was like to be poor. When he talked about clean water, unlike someone like myself who came from a background where there was always piped water, Chris was able to break down the meaning of not having clean water, what it meant in terms of washing, disinfecting one's hands, preventing the spread of illness, things like this. But he was very trusted by people. When Chris, the Communist Party for a number of years asked that the ANC release him from the National Working Committee to become Deputy General Secretary, and the ANC was not prepared to release him. But then in 1991 at the Communist Party Congress, he was elected General Secretary, and the ANC just more or less accepted that. A lot of people in MK were very upset because they really felt that Chris Hani was a person who cared about them in a way that no one else did. And you hear these stories about people getting out of the country, meeting him in Lesotho, and not seeing them for years. Just meeting them briefly, not seeing them for years. And then when he meets them again, he remembers them. At the Communist Party Congress in 1991, he was in the chair a lot of the time, and he seemed to know everyone's names. And I think this sort of characteristic of really taking the trouble to know the people with whom he worked made him a very unique human being. He was a fighter, and he went into the country as a leader. He was one of the first to infiltrate into the country as an MK soldier. In 1974, he went underground on a number of occasions into the country because he believed you cannot ask other people to do what you're not prepared to do yourself. But he didn't want to force people to do what they were not ready for. It is very well known that before groups crossed the border to infiltrate into apartheid South Africa, Chris would sometimes call people aside and say to them, "Are you sure you are ready to go in? Have you got no unfinished business here?" He didn't want people to go into the country and find that because of some unfinished business back in Lusaka or wherever they were coming from, or some psychological or other problems, they were not able to do their mission properly and could possibly even betray. But he was not keen on this idea of lots of dead soldiers unnecessarily. So he was very concerned about that. In the leadership, he was a very powerful speaker. If there was a problem, for example, disarming the self-defense units, getting MK to accept that armed action had to be suspended, they had to send Chris Hani to speak to these people because people were very angry. They were very angry because the decision had been taken to suspend armed action without consultation with the membership or with MK. People were very unhappy about this, but Chris came to accept the necessity of disarmament, and he had to go to all these dangerous spots. Even during the period of exile, when there was a mutiny, Chris went into the camp of the mutineers unarmed to talk to them. And I think, they have these songs about Chris Hani, there will never be another. And that is true.
So many people also see Chris Hani as a revolutionary and not really in favor of a peace settlement.
See, I think it's a mistake to think that being a revolutionary means that you only favor violent solutions and that you are not in favor of peace. I think the liberation struggle in South Africa, and Chris Hani knew this very well, was in favor of peaceful solutions and pursued these for a number of decades. And only when it was impossible did they resort to arms. And in the case of Chris Hani, like with Mandela, when the possibility of peace arose, he worked very hard to make the peace work. That is why I've said that Chris Hani had this image of a real soldier in the eyes of MK and very militant youth as well. So Chris decided to work very, very hard to make sure that the peace did hold. He also understood that the people who were dying were primarily people in the townships, and the people who were dying were the oppressed people of South Africa. They were the main ones who would benefit from peace, but peace that was tied to a free election. So he was not just saying peace, we surrender, not at all. He was saying peace for a democratic South Africa.
So we know that he was a fighter, but did he contribute towards the thinking of the ANC and the SACP?
Well, you know, I was one of those people who would be writing theoretical articles, and there were few of us who would be doing this. And we were not able to translate what we said into the language of ordinary people. We had the sort of university type intellectualism. Now, Chris was very conversant with everything that was being written, discussed, not just written by people like me, but he was able to go to the villages and break it down, as I was saying about water, exactly what it meant. He was able to break it down, and he was able also to do this. He would go all over the country. He was Xhosa speaking, but he would be going up to the Venda of Bantustan, all these places. But in the Eastern Cape, they were particularly receptive to him in the rural areas because he spoke what's called deep Xhosa, and he would explain it in a way that was meaningful. So what you had then was a gap that had to be filled between overly intellectual theoretical documents and then communicating these with the examples that were meaningful to people who came from the poorest of the poor. And it's a big mistake to think that Chris was just brawn. Chris was a very, very bright guy, but in addition to that, he had the facility, he had the experience to be able to explain it to ordinary people.
Thank you, Professor. That was Professor Raymond Suttner speaking to Crema Media's Polity about remembering Chris Hani.